All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Sorry, some technical difficulties. So I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Teves, Dovi and Nina Elman, in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a bas mitzvah. May she continue to be a source of nachas for the entire mishpacha. A week of learning sponsors, Alan and Sherry Steinmetz, in honor of Allison and Adam Steinmetz's anniversary, and in honor of all of the Shiurim. Our day of learning sponsor, Doug and Gail Stenger, in memory of Doug's grandfather, Avram Moshe ben Shraga Feivel, Zichron Livracha. We hope in the merit of our Talmud Torah and the Sham will have an aliyah, and the family in Nechama. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Sonia and Baruch Fishel Kozlovsky, in commemoration of the 18th yahrzeit of Rabbi Price, Zichrona Livracha. May all of the learning, the Daf Yomi, all of the Shiurim, be an aliyah for the neshama of Moreno Arav Shlomo Aryeh ben Moshe, Zichrona Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah and the family in Nechama. And to thank Baruch and Bracha Rifkin for dedicating this shir today for the yahrzeit of Rabbi Reuven Rifkin, Rav Reuven ben Tzvi, who was Osik in Baltimore community from 1914 to 1953. Incredible. We hope all of these neshamas who worked so hard on behalf of our community will have the Lichtika Gan Eden and their families in Nechama. All right, so with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, Mirz Hashem. Today's daf is Mem Gimel 43, and we are actually picking up. We Baruch Hashem got to the bottom of Mem Beis Amud Beis yesterday, 2 lines up from the bottom. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. So remember again, we're delving in today to the fascinating discussion regarding ta'aruos of chametz. Ultimately, again, mixtures of chametz. Remember, up until now, we've been solely focused on just what we call chametz be'en, just chametz, a loaf of bread, right? Something explicitly unadulterated chametz. Now we delve into the discussion of ta'arovis, which will have some interesting halachic ramifications and repercussions as well. So Rabbi Eliezer said, "Af tachshitei noshim." So Rabbi Eliezer said in the Mishnah, even tachshitim are accessories, even the accessories of women, ultimately, again, are included in this din of chametz. So says the Gemara, Tachshite nashim sagdaita. What does that mean? Jewelry, accessories of women are included in the prohibition of chametz? Ela ema af tipulei nashim. Rather, explain it instead of meaning tipulei nashim. Moses, this goes back to yesterday. Tipulei nashim are depilatories, a cream or a paste that a woman would use to remove hair. Those are included in the prohibition of chametz. Damar of Yehuda Amarav Benos Yisrael Shegiu top of Mem Gimel Shegiu Lepirkan V'lo Yagiu L'Shanim. What happens if a woman, if a girl reached the age of physical maturation, but she was maturing a little bit on the earlier side, and therefore again she did not want to have physical signs of maturation? So what happens? So they would want to remove unwanted hair. So the Gemara says Benos Aniyim Toflos Osan Besid. So the poor girls would use lime as a depilatory. Benos ashirim toflos osan besolas. The rich girls would use fine flour. Benos malachim b'shemen hamar. And the royalty would use shemen hamar. We'll discuss what that means. Shnei amar shisha chadoshim b'shemen hamar. Amazing from Megillah Esther. Right? When talking about how the women prepared for their night of Achashverosh, so the Megillah says they would spend 6 months in Shemen Hamor. My Shemen Hamor. Rav Huna Bar Yirmiyah Omer Satechas. It is Satechas. Rashi says, interestingly enough, over here, Satechas lo isparish. I don't know what Satechas is. Interesting when Rashi says that. So it happens to be in the Hagos, in the Mesoras Hashatz, Shas, He quotes over here by that letter Zayin. He says, Ubeminochos Perish Rashi Shekorin Balsima or Balishma. So we'll say it could be that. So interesting. So apparently Rashi elsewhere seems to indicate that again it's perhaps some type of balsam oil. All right. Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba Amar Shemen Zayshlo Hevi Shlish. Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba says what's Shemen Amar? Shemen Amar is olive oil, but it comes from olives that have only reached 1/3 of their maturity. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Apinkinin shemen zayis shlo hevi shlish. Apinkinin is another name for olive oil, which has not reached 1/3 of its maturity. So we'll say, meaning from olives that are only 1/3 of their maturity. Shemen, so the Gemara says, v'lama sachin also. Why ultimately again would one smear themselves with this type of oil? Mipnei shemesha es hasear, because it goes in and removes unwanted hair. Uma'adin es habasar, and it gives the skin a beautiful glow. Za'aklal kol shuhumi min dagam. So we'll say, so good. So that's the case of tachshiti noshim. So the Mishnah said, this is the klal kol shuhumi min dagan. Anything ultimately again that has within it grain, hareza over bepesach. One is in violation of chametz on Pesach. So the Gemara says, Tanya, Amr Rabbi Yeshua, v'chimi achar sheshaninu, kol shehu min dagan, hareza over bepesach, lama manu chachamim meselu. So the Gemara now asks a good question. See, here's what's interesting about the flow of the Mishnah. Right? So the way the Mishnah reads is, the Mishnah gives you a list of items that have chametz mixed into it. Right? And then the Mishnah says, by the way, here's the klal, anything that has chametz in it, you'll be over on Pesach. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why don't you just skip the examples and just go to the klal, right? Just go ahead and write the principle. Anything that has chametz mixed into it, you're in violation for that on Pesach. Why do you have to start going through kusach bavli and this one and that one? Just skip the examples, go to the klal. But this is actually very profound. Because Chazal wanted us to be familiar with certain types of foods. They wanted us to be familiar with certain types of food. You're going to see not just for chametz purposes, but for other purposes as well. And with their names. Kiha, listen to this, because the Gemara tells a story. Kiha, Tahu bar ma'arava, ikla labava. Abba said there was once a Jew who traveled from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Amar lehu, karivi li mischilta. So he said, now apparently the man brought his own food with him, but he said, give me maschilta. Now both say, maschilta literally means a condiment. So this man had brought his own meat. He was looking for, some barbecue sauce, whatever it was. So he said, give me some maschilta. So, shama de ka'amri karivu lekusach. So, we'll say you find this often, that there were different, I don't know if the word is, not dialects, but like, they spoke in a little bit different ways in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. So the man asked for a mischilta, which was a condiment, and they said, you want a condiment? We'll give you kusach. Because we'll say the truth is, kusach is a condiment also. It was a dip, right? You don't eat kusach, you dip into kusach. So they said, the guy wants a dip. Remember again, the guy from Eretz Yisrael didn't tell anyone what he wanted a dip for. He wanted a dipping sauce for his meat. He didn't say that. So they said, he wants a dipping sauce. What's the best dipping sauce we have here in Bavel? Everyone knows. Babylonian kusach. It's all the rave, right? So they said, bring him kusach. So we'll say, so what happened? So because this individual learned Mishnayos, Kevan Dishama Kusach Pirish. But since he was familiar with kusach, and he knew that what kusach was milchiks. It's made out of whey and moldy bread and a couple of other ingredients as well. So he knew ultimately to avoid it. Sirabos says it's very interesting. So therefore, although the Gemara says, you're right, we could have just espoused the principle or the rule in the Mishnah and could have left off all of the examples, halach l'maaseh, it's important to be versed. It's an incredible yisod. Or what the Gemara is also saying is, it's a very profound idea. That sometimes in the learning of halacha, so it's tempting to just tell me, is it mutter or is it aser? Right? Let's just get to the bottom line. Mutter aser, right? Tamei tar, kosher treif. What Chazal is sensitizing us to is sometimes it's good to know the background a little bit. Because when you have the background, sometimes again the application of those very laws becomes a little bit easier. Good. The Gemara goes weiter. Tanya. Good. Fine. Good. Pari elu ba'azhara. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So remember again, the Mishnah said that if you have an item that has chametz mixed into it, hari elu ba'azhara. It's a lav. It's a lav, but not kares. So Rabbi say, we know the Torah puts down that there is a punishment of kares when one goes ahead and consumes chametz. What the Gemara now is going to extrapolate from Mishnah is that the din kares for chametz consumption only comes about when you are eating what's called chametz be'en. actual unadulterated chametz, a loaf of bread, a bagel, right? That's kares. But if you are eating a food item which has chametz mixed into it, although that is punishable by a lav, it's not kares. Again, we'll have to define the parameters of this. So the Gemara says as follows: Man tana de chametz dagan gamra aydi taroves v'nuksha be'enei belav. Who is the opinion who holds that chametz gamer that is mixed in, that's in a mixture, or chametz nuksha be'en? Then I both say, now this is very interesting. Chametz nuksha, I both say we're going to spend some more significant time. This is not the primary sugya of it. We'll see it. But we'll say chametz nuksha, it actually has, it's a machlogus what the definition. Well, look at Rashi for just a moment. You see Rashi mantana? It's right across from, if you have a newer Gemara, it's right across from where it says the Hagos Habach. Mantana. De masnisin de isli chametz dagan gamer shnis arev b'minacher ve'eno be'en shinimuach. So we'll say, who is the Tana who holds that if you have actual chametz that got mixed in with other items, so now you have a tarovis, a mixture of chametz. A mixture of chametz, right? And if you consume that mixture, that it will be punishable by a lav. Who is that opinion? Inami chametz nuksha. So we'll say, look how Rashi defines this over here. Nuksha is ra v'isei be'enei. So chametz nuksha, we'll say, is that it's chametz ra. Chametz ra. Now, what does chametz ra literally mean? It's bad chametz. What does that mean? So we'll have to delve into this. V'isei be'enei. So we'll say we're going to see chametz nuksha can mean one of two things: either chametz, where the chimutz process began but was stunted, or chametz nuksha could be its chametz, but it's not really edible. So we'll say, for example, interestingly enough, that one of the classic examples of contemporary chametz nuksha is scotch, right? Scotch is chametz, but it's chametz nuksha. That's because technically speaking, actually the fermentation process is actually stopped at a certain point in time. It's chametz nuksha, which has a lot of halachic ramifications. Chametz nuksha is not treated the same as regular chametz. Again, so we'll say, when you look at this case in the Mishnah, when you look at the case in the Mishnah, certain examples of this, like kolon shel sofrim, the paste of scribes, what we saw actually turns out to be shoemaker's paste, also leatherworker's paste. So we'll say, so again, you look at those items, bepashtos, that's not really chametz. I mean, let me say it differently. That's not the type of stuff that you would say, I'm hungry, I'm in the mood for something. What am I in the mood for? Is there any shoemaker's paste around? No one's eating that. Bepashtos, although it's not going to kill you if you eat it, that's what's called chametz nuksha. That's chametz ra. That's chametz ra. So we're gonna use the definition right now of chametz nuksha as just chametz ra, chametz which is technically edible, but no one eats it. So who is the Tana who holds that if you have a mixture of chametz or chametz nuksha and you consume that it is punishable ultimately again by a lav and not by kares? Am Rabbi Yehuda, Amarav, Rabbi Meir. It's Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, this sanya seyor yisarei finos no lekalbo. So both say if you have seyor, and both say seyor, we normally translate as sourdough, as opposed to, let's say, chametz. So seyor is a leavening agent. So if you have seyor, what do you have to do? You have to burn it. Now Rashi says over here, seyor is shalonis chametz kol tzarko. Then I both say, interestingly enough, seyor is a good example of an item. Sourdough generally is chametz, but hasn't become fully chametz. That's why it's able to go ahead and serve as a leavening agent for something else, right? I both say, if you take a fully baked, a fully processed piece of bread, that can't usually serve as a leavening agent for something else. The sourdough, because it hasn't fully leavened, that's the koach of its leavening powers. So if you take seyor, so what's the halacha? You have to burn it. But yet the Gemara says, you could also give it to your dog. But if you eat seyor, if you eat sourdough, you get malchus. Hagufa kasher. And the Gemara says inherently contradictory. Amrit seyor yisare. If you just said seyor, ultimately again should be burned. Alma aser ba'ano. Therefore it's aser ba'ano. Then you say you can give it to your dog. Alma muter ba'ano. Therefore it's muter ba'ano. So what's going on over here? Hachi kamar. So we'll say before we go on, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Seyor. So Rashi says, Shalom is chametz kol tzarka. But we'll say, now look at the rest of this Rashi. Seir pligi b'masnisin. I will say there is a machlokes in the Mishnah that we will see later on, Memches. So in a couple of days from now, we'll see an interesting machlokes, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, about the definition of seir. So listen to this. So Rashi says, seir, ech shech sifu panav, v'zeu tchilas chimutzo. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Meir says that as soon as the outside of the sourdough becomes white, that means it's sourdough. That's the chimutz process. The leavening process has begun. That's Rabbi Meir's definition. Ulu Rabbi Huda, havi seir shehischel listok kivar sdokin dakin kekarni chagofim. Echad lekan v'echad lekan aval shechsifu panav Rabbi Huda matzehi. So both listen to this. So here's what's interesting. Rabbi Huda holds that seir is only considered to be chametz when cracks develop in the dough. Cracks. So Rabbi Huda says, like the things of a grasshopper. Antennas, thank you. I'm going like this, right? The antennas of the grasshopper, right? It's Bachshon, we have video, right? Right? So the antennas of the grasshopper. So it's actually fascinating. So according to Rabbi Meir, sourdough, right, the seir becomes chametz as soon as the outside becomes white. That's earlier on in the process. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't become chametz until later on, that cracks, small cracks, actually develop in the face of the dough. So we'll say the reason this is important is as follows. According to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda's definition of seir is already chametz gomer. Rabbi Meir holds once a dough develops cracks, that's chametz gomer. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir's definition of turning white, that's not chametz at all. He calls that, you know what he calls that? He calls that matzah. It's not chametz. It's not chametz. This is machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Now again, we'll get into it later on. The Gemara is just bringing it up over here. Alma, what the Gemara's halachic Gemara means to say, seir yisarif. If you have seir, you have to burn it. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Huda. So both say Rabbi Meir's. So if seir reaches the level of chametz, according to Rabbi Meir, then according to Rabbi Meir, if it becomes white on the outside, you have to burn it. According to Rabbi Huda, if it develops cracks, you have to burn it. So the Gemara says, "V'nosel lefnei kalbo," or you can give it to your dog. What's that case? The Rabbi Meir, the Rabbi Yehuda. So both say that. Listen to this. According to Rabbi Yehuda, if the seir only reached the threshold of Rabbi Meir, which is it turns white, but it didn't develop any cracks, then halacha l'maisa you could totally get even hana from that. You can give it to your dog. Va'ochlo ba'arboim, and if you eat seir, ultimately again you get malchus. Asan Rabbi Meir. Both say that goes according to Rabbi Meir's definition. So according to Rabbi Meir, if the sourdough turns white on the outside, which means the chimutz process has begun, halacha l'maisa, if you consume it, you get malchus. The Gemara says, "Shamini Rabbi Meir nukshe be'enei balav v'chol shekein chametz dagan gamer ayidei taravas." Rabbi say this would be a good example of chametz nukshe. So sourdough that turned white, stunted chimutz process. That's called chametz nukshe. Shabbos says, you see, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa chametz nukshe, which again, Rabbi say we're translating as chametz ra. Right now, we'll just use Rashi's definition. It's not good chametz, right? It's chametz ra. So, or a mixture of chametz into a larger mixture. Those items will be prohibited, but not by kares. Ultimately, again, by a lav. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman says, no, it's not Rabbi Meir, but rather again it's Rabbi Elazar. This sanya al chametz dagan gamar anush kares. If you eat chametz mamish, what's what we call chametz be'en, a bagel, a loaf of bread, the halacha is you get kares. Al eruvo belav divrei Rabbi Eliezer. But if you eat a mixture containing chametz, then ultimately, again, that is quote unquote only punishable by a lav. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Racham say al chametz dagan gamra anush kares. If you go out and you eat chametz be'en, you'll get there's a chiv kares. However, al eruvo below klum. We'll say this is wild. According to the Chachamim say if you eat a mixture containing chametz, there is no prohibition. Let's see, hear this? Pretty wild. There is no prohibition at all. According to the Chachamim, the prohibition of chametz is only when you eat chametz be'en. when you ate plain, standalone chametz. But if you were to go ahead and eat a ta'aroves, a mixture of chametz, the Chachamim say there's not even a lav. Now, of course, we don't paskin this way. We'll say just so you should know for your own edification purposes, we paskin like, well, we'll get to how we paskin. So the Gemara says, V'shamini Rabbi Elazar da'amar chametz dagan gamra de ta'aroves b'lav v'chol shekein chametz nuksha be'en. So we'll say, so you see that according to Rabbi Elazar, halacha l'maisa, chametz dagan gamra de ta'aroves, if you have a mixture of chametz, that is punishable by a lav, and all the more so, chametz nuksha. Good. Shabbos says, so now we have two approaches. So we have Rabbi Yehuda saying that the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. We have Rav Nachman saying that the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer. They're both saying that they're both effective. They're saying the same thing. So they're both agreeing that what? That a ta'arova is a mixture containing chametz, as well as chametz nuksha will be punishable by a lav. Good. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman, my Tamar Lamak Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, why does Rav Nachman not hold of Rabbi Yehuda? Right? Why does Rav Nachman choose to identify Rabbi Eliezer as the opinion and not Rabbi Meir? So the Gemara will tell you why. Because he will say like this, maybe Rabbi Meir only holds his shita by nuksha. Because we'll say, chometz nuksha, as much as it's, according to Rashi, chometz ra, it's still chometz be'en. Right? It's still unadulterated chometz. Aval chametz dagan gamra ayidei ta'aroves lo. But maybe who says Rabbi Meir would hold that ultimately again there's a lav by a mixture of chametz? Rabbi Yehuda my time alama Rav Nachman. And why does Rabbi Yehuda not hold like Rav Nachman? Amar lecha at kan lo kam Rabbi Eliezer hasam ela chametz dagan gamra ayidei ta'aroves. Rabbi Eliezer only expressed his shita by ta'aroves, by a mixture of chametz. Aval nukshe be'inei lo amar. But he did not directly address the Yeshua of Chametz Nuksha. So Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yehuda. Remember again, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that the Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Kol machmetzes lo sochelu. The pasuk says, Kol machmetzes you should not eat. L'rabos kusach habavli v'sheichar hamadi v'chometz ha'adomi v'zeisom hamitzri. So we've actually seen this before. So the brisa says like this. The brisa says, Kol machmetzes. The Torah phrases the prohibition of chametz in two ways. Number one, you can't eat chametz. Number two, kol machmetzes. So here the Gemara is understanding that machmetzes is coming to include what? Is coming to include ta'aroves chametz. That even a mixture of chametz is going to be aser. So says the Gemara. So therefore it comes to include all of these items mentioned in the Mishnah. Yachol yei anush kares. You might have thought that because I'm learning enough of Ta'aroves Chametz, learning out from the pasuk, that I should be punishable even by kares. Talmud Lomar, ki kol ochel chametz v'nichrasa. Al chametz dagan gamra anush kares va'ali ruvo bilav. So we'll say this is actually quite amazing. So the Gemara is being mechalik, or the Bryce is being mechalik over here between kol machmetzes lo sochelu and ki kol ochel chametz. Chametz refers to what? This is very important. Chametz refers to chametz be'en. Chametz be'en means standalone, unadulterated chametz. A bagel, a challah roll, a piece of bread. I will say it's not limited to these things. Pretzels, cookies, cake. That's chametz be'en. If you consume that type of chametz on Pesach, chas v'shalom, it's punishable by kares. Kol machmetzes comes to include anything which has chametz as an ingredient. That's also aser. But ultimately, again, only aser by a lav, not aser by kares, or not punishable by kares, I should say. So the Gemara says, Man shamas don't really ale ruvo belav. Who is the opinion who holds that ta'aroves chametz, a mixture of chametz, punishable by a lav? Rabbi Eliezer he. Ve'ilu nukshe be'ene lo ka'amar. But I will say, interesting of Rabbi Eliezer, yet what are we not addressing over here? We're not addressing chametz nuksha. Shema mina nuksha l'Rabbi Eliezer leslei. Then Rabbi you see from here that it's possible that according that Rabbi Eliezer maybe holds that chametz nuksha is not aser. Rabbi Eliezer iruvo belav minale. Where does Rabbi Eliezer know that a mixture of chametz ultimately will be aser as well? D'chsiv kol machmetzes lo sochelu. Because the pasuk says kol machmetzes, any mixture of chametz you cannot eat. Ihachi kares nami lechayiv. If that's the case, ultimately, again, why not be chayiv kares as well? The Gemara says, the haksiv ki kol ochel machmetzes v'nichrasa. So ultimately, again, the pasuk says, "Whoever eats machmetzes v'nichrisa." But one second, hahumi boy le'lechidisanya. But we learned that machmetzes for something else. Machmetzes inli elishin is chametz me'ilov. Machmetzes, I only know an item that became chametz on its own. Machmas davar acher minay. And I will say, from where do I know that even if the chimutz process was sparked by something else, that it's also asur? Talmud lomar kol machmetzes v'nichrisa. Ihachi delav nami lahachi huda asa. If that's the case, says the Gemara, but don't you use this ultimately again to establish a lav? Ella, taima Rabbi Eliezer, other was you have to say Rabbi Eliezer shita is like this, mikol. Both say ultimately again you have to say that the shita of Rabbi Eliezer is gleaned from the word kol. Kol, it says kol machmetzas lo sochelu. The Gemara says hasam nami haksiv kol. But it also says over here, ki kol ochel machmetzes v'nichrasa, hahumi boile l'rabos es hanoshim. Shabbos said, this is incredible. The second kol, according to Rabbi Eliezer, comes to include women in the prohibition of chametz. So we'll say, what does this mean? This is incredible. The Gemara says, Nashim, Rabbi Yehuda Amarav Nafka. But Nashim, the obligation, or I should say, the fact that women are included in the prohibition of chametz, we learned that out from Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara says, Dam Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, V'chein turns to Rabbi Yishmael, Amarkra, Ish o Isha, Kiyas Sumikal Chato Sa'adam. The pasuk says, if a man or a woman will do anything that is prohibited, Hishva HaKosov Ish L'Isha, L'chol Onshin Sheva Torah. Both said the Torah equates men with women for all punishments. That although there may be a distinction between men and women regarding positive commandments, as we'll discuss, when it comes to prohibitions, men and women are the same. Amadej, both say, it's derech. But nevertheless, I need it by chametz. I still need an additional limud to teach me that women are prohibited in chametz. Why? Sagadait chamina, because one might have thought, holaluksiv, lo sochal alav chametz, shivas yomim tochal alav matzos. Because I will say, one might have thought that after all, the pasuk says, for 7, right, lo sochal alav chametz. Let me just find the Rambam here for just a second. Okay, good. We'll come to that in a second. Good. Lo sochal alav chametz, shivas yom tochal alav matzos. So the pasuk says, 7, you shall not eat chametz. 7 days you shall eat matzahs. So you might have thought as follows: Kol sheyeshno bekum echol matzah, yeshno b'bal tochal chametz. Shabbos said, I might have thought as follows: whoever has an obligation, the Torah goes out of its way to link the obligation to eat matzah with the prohibition to eat chametz. So I might have thought as follows: whoever has the obligation to go and eat matzah has a prohibition to consume chametz. And based on this, I would have said, V'hani nashi, hoyo v'lesnu bekum echol matzah, dahavile mitzvahs aseh shazman gramahi, ema bebal tochal chametz, nami nislehu. So you say, I might have thought as follows, that since women don't have an obligation to eat matzah, and I will say, why don't women have an obligation to eat matzah? Bepashtos, why not? It's a mitzvahs aseh shazman grama. It's a time-bound commandment. So I might have thought that because women don't have an obligation to eat matzah, therefore what? They also don't have the prohibition to consume chametz. Because after all, the Torah links these two things together. Therefore the Gemara says, Kamashmala, no. Kamashmala, and I will say, now I understand something over here. Kamashmala, the Gemara is saying that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the pasuk says, Ki kol ochel chametz, or Ki kol ochel machmetzes. The ki kol, or the kol, comes to include women in the prohibition, ultimately, of chametz consumption. To which the Gemara said, but one second, Bahashta de Israbi luhu bebal tocha chametz, Israbi luhu nami la'achilas matzah. And now that women are included in the prohibition of chametz, we also include them in the positive commandment to eat matzah. Ki Rabbi Eliezer, like Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer, Nashim chayavas b'achilas matzah dvar Torah. Women are in fact biblically obligated to eat matzah. We'll say that's how we paskin. Even though it is a mitzvahs aseisha, it is a mitzvah, it's a time-bound commandment. Nevertheless, women will be obligated in matzah consumption. Shnei amar lo sochol alav chametz. Kol sheyeshno b'bal tochal chametz, yeshno b'achilas matzah. So you'll say, in fact, interestingly enough, we accept the first version of this argument, which is, in general, we assume there is no distinction between men and women for prohibitions. And therefore, again, I both say the linkage of chametz and matzah teaches me as follows. Whoever is bound by the prohibitions of Pesach, or by the prohibitions of chametz, I should say, is obligated in the consumption of matzah. Kol sheyeshno b'bal tochal chametz, whoever is not permitted to eat chametz, yeshno ba'achilas matzah, ultimately again is obligated in matzah consumption. Therefore, v'hani noshi nami chov yeshno b'al tochal chametz. Therefore, these women as well, women as well, because ultimately again they are prohibited in chametz consumption. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, they are obligated in the consumption of matzah. So, both say what I want to point out over here, just so you follow the flow of this limud. What just happened over here is like this. The way the limud worked was the Gemara is extremely contrary to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is learning out ki kol ochel machmetzes, everyone is coming to include women. Now, once I know that women are obligated, according to Rabbi Eliezer, once I know that women are obligated in the prohibition of chametz, therefore what? The fact that the Torah links chametz and matzah, therefore once I understand that they are obligated in the prohibition of chametz, therefore what? They also become obligated in the consumption of matzah. Now I just want to point out, you don't need that limud. According to the way we're going to understand, that's Rabbi Eliezer's understanding. Kol. We have a much simpler limud. Our much simpler limud is what Rabbi say. When it comes to the world of lavim, there is no distinction between men and women. So therefore, again, women of course are obligated in the prohibitions of chametz. Now, once the Torah links chametz and matzah, therefore what? Women will be obligated in the obligation to consume matzah as well. Rabbi Eliezer just has this extra step of the kol, which we'll discuss. Umay chazis, the high kol rabuye noshim. See, also here's what's interesting. In Rabbi Eliezer's view, so ultimately again, kol is coming to include women, but ultimately again it excludes a taroves, mixture containing chametz. How do you know that? So why don't you say instead, maybe it doesn't come to include women, but rather it comes to include a mixture of chametz. That's actually very interesting. Mistabra, kai ba'ochlin, mar ba'ochlin. Kai ba'ochlin, mar b'nechalin. I will say, if a pasuk is talking about eaters, right, people, then it makes sense that kol will come to include people. But if the subject of the pasuk is ultimately again people, it doesn't make sense that it would come to include objects. So we'll see here. In other words, that kikolo chal machmetzes is talking about people. So b'pashtos, if kol is coming to include something, be marbes something, it makes sense that it's coming to include another category of people. Masha'inkein, if kikol chal machmetzes, the subject is people, doesn't make sense that it would be coming to include another category of food. So therefore, again, kikol, the Gemara understands, coming to include women, not coming to include taruv as chametz. Is that true? That whenever the subject of the pasuk is talking about people, it only includes additional people, doesn't come to include additional food items? Is that true? Vatanya, we learn about this, is very interesting. Kikol ochel chelev min abehema sheyakrivun. Both say, so the pasuk says, Kikol ochel chelev min abehema sheyakruv mimene ishel Hashem. If you eat the chelev of a sacrificial animal, that is punishable by kares. So the Gemara says, "Inni ela chelev tamimin sheroi likarev." I only know that this applies to a chelev of an unblemished animal that is fit for sacrificial offering. Bali mumin minayin. So how do I know that even if I eat the chelev of a blemished animal, that is punishable by kares as well? Talmud lomar kikol. The pasuk says kikol, and kikol comes to include all forms of chelev, even from a blemished animal. But one second, but I will say 1 second. What's the subject of the pasuk, Rabbi say? What's the subject? Kikol ochel chelev. Who is it talking about? Who's it? Kikol talking about who? People. So look what you just did. You just told me whenever the subject of the pasuk is people, and you have a riboy like kikol comes to include another group of people. But here you're using kikol, where the subject is people, and you're using it to include what? Another form of chelev, even chelev from a blemished animal. What's going on over here? Tishmar says, not a problem. Hasam deleka ochlin mar b'nei acholin. Hacha diika ochlin lo shaveklu ochlin mar b'nei acholin. Both say the Gemara says like this. Everything depends on the context. By chelev, we already know that men and women are both subject to the laws of chelev. So because of that, kikol, and I will say, why? How do I know that men and women are going to both be subject to chelev? Because it's a prohibition. There's no there's no mitzvah say, there's no time-bound component. So therefore I will say, I have no one else to include. All right, men and women are already included in the prohibition of chelev. So when I have no other group of people to include in the kikol ribui, I'll use the kikol ribui to do what? To create another category of food items. In this case, the chelev of a blemished animal. But einachinami, when you could use a kol to go ahead and include another subset of people, then einachinami, that's preferable. So come back now to chametz. I might have thought that women ultimately should not be subject to the halachos of chametz. Why not? Because remember, there's a linkage between matzah and chametz, and matzah is a mitzvah saseh shazman gram, a time-bound commandment. So I might have thought that just like women are exempt from matzah, therefore they should be exempted from the prohibition of chametz. Kikol comes to include women ultimately in the prohibition of chametz. And then, of course, once women are obligated in the prohibition of chametz, or including the prohibition of chametz, they're also obligated in the mitzvah saseh of matzah. V'ra'abanan the leslu erev kikol lo darshi. And the Rabbanan Abosai who hold that halacha l'maisa, again, there is no prohibition of ta'aroves chametz. We also have to remember, again, I'm sorry, I said before Rabbi Eliezer, it's really the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan who hold that there is no prohibition of ta'aroves chametz, kol lo darshi. They ultimately, again, don't darshan kol. They don't darshan kol at all. Ela noshim and all. So we'll say, if the Rabbanan don't darshan kol, then ultimately, again, from where do they know that women are obligated or subject to the prohibition of chametz, to which the Gemara says, So, Ela nashim minalu, so where do the Rabbanan, who don't darshan kol, from where do they know that women ultimately, again, will be subject to the prohibition of chametz? Listen to this. Kol lo darshi, while it is true that the Rabbanan don't darshan the word kol to include another subset of people, ki kol darshi. We'll say they do darshan when you find the phrase ki kol. And I'll remember again, by chametz, you find not just kol, but what? Ki kol. Shivas yamim shalo yimatzei b'vaseichem. Ki kol ochel machmetzes v'nichresa nefesh mi'ameha. Ultimately, again, so the Rabbanan will darshan ki kol. That's like a double ribui. Ki kol will come to include women. Rabbi Eliezer, ima kol l'rabos es hanoshim. Ki kol l'rabos es eruvo. Rabbi Eliezer, why don't you say, ultimately again, that kol comes to include women, and ki kol comes to include ta'aroves, mixture of chametz. V'chitema ki kol Rabbi Eliezer lo darish. So maybe you'll say that halacha l'maisa, maybe Rabbi Eliezer doesn't darshan ki kols. V'atanya, that's not true. Sa'ar bal taktiru, ainli ela kulo. Miktsas, I'm supposed to listen to this. So the pasuk says as follows: Kol mincha shetakrivu laHashem lo se'aseh chametz. So we'll say when you offer up a carbon mincha cannot be chametz. And the pasuk says, Ki kol sa'ar v'chol devash lo saktir meni yishal Hashem. Because any sa'ar, any chametz, or any honey cannot be offered up as an offering to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rabbi say, so watch this. So the Gemara says, Einli ela kulo miktsaso minayin. I only know ultimately again that the whole carbon can't be chametz. How do I know that even if part of it is chametz, it's problematic? Talmud lomar kol. Therefore, the pasuk says kol. Eruva minayin. How do I know that even if there's chametz mixed in, it's problematic? Talmud lomar ki kol. Ultimately, again, because the pasuk says ki kol, which comes to include any amount of chametz mixed into the mincha. Man shamis lei the darish kol. The both say ultimately again, who is the opinion who darshans kol? Rabbi Eliezer. And yet, what do you see over here? V'kadarish ki kol, and here he's darshaning ki kol as well. Yet you just told Rabbi Eliezer it doesn't darshan ki kol. Einachinami, the Gemara says kasha. It's a good question. So we'll say, so the Gemara ends off over here. We're not finished with the sugya, but the Gemara ends off over here. Ultimately, enmeshed in this discussion, here's what we know. We know everyone agrees that if you go ahead and you eat chametz be'en, that's what? What's the punishment? Kares. That's indisputable. After that is where the machlokas begins. So we'll say, so it appears that we have two different opinions, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer. Ultimately, seemingly both of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir quotes Rabbi Huda. Thank you. Rabbi Meir quoting Rabbi Huda, and then ultimately Rabbi Eliezer. Two different opinions, both being put forward as the authors of our Mishnah. Seemingly both of them subscribing to the idea that chametz ta'aroves chametz, which means if you have a mixture of chametz, or chametz nuksha, which again we'll just accept Rashi's definition. Chametz nuksha means what? Chametz ra. Which again, that's still exactly not clear, but it would appear based on the Siyar conversation means chametz whose chimutz process has been stunted. Halacha l'maisa, if you consume either a mixture of chametz or chametz nuksha, that will be punishable by a lav. By a lav, not by kares, but by a lav. Now the Gemara spends a lot of time trying to understand, do Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Eliezer actually say these? Do they actually hold these respective shitas? So we'll say that's the continuation of the Gemara. Let me just tell you the Rambam, just for clarity purposes, so that you should emerge. We'll say as much as sometimes it's good to learn through a sugya and then do the halacha lamaisa. Let me tell you the halacha lamaisa now, so it'll give you, I think, a little bit of clarity as we continue to go through the sugya. So listen to this. The Rambam paskins. This is in Hilchos Chametz Umatzah, Perek Aleph Halacha Vav. Ein chayav in kares ela al achilas atzmo shel chametz. So we'll say, number one, the Rambam paskins, like what the Gemara said, you're only chayiv kares if you eat what's called chametz be'en. Chametz be'en. Unadulterated chametz, standalone chametz, a bagel, a piece of bread, a cookie, a pretzel, a piece of cake. Aval eruv chametz, kigon kusach habavli, sheichar hamadi, v'chala dome lahem, midvarim shachametz mu'urav bahem, im achlon bepesach, v'ein bo kares. I'm sorry, im achlon bepesach loke, v'ein bo kares shenemar, kol machmetzes lo sochelu. So just want to point out, there's two different lavim. There's the Torah says, you're not allowed to eat chametz, that refers to chametz ben v'nichrasei ke kares. Kol machmetzas lo sochilu, the Rambam understands means chametz nuksha and chametz ta'aroves. I'm sorry, chametz nuksha and ta'aroves chametz, a mixture. So we'll say that is indeed how we pass halacha ma'is. Which we'll say, I just want to point out, if you notice, no one's arguing on this. Everyone is saying it's just a shaila. The Gemara wanted to suggest that these are the shitos of Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara challenges whether Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Eliezer are really saying, really holding these shitos, but those are the shitos halacha ma'is, and that is the shita ultimately espoused in the Mishnah. So we'll stop over here. We'll pick up. We're not finished with this sugya. We'll continue. I will say one last thing I should just tell you is in the world of ta'aroves chametz. We're not getting into this now because we haven't reached this in the Gemara yet. But I just want to point out that in the world of ta'aroves chametz, even the Rambam says for ta'aroves, you're only chayiv if you consume a certain amount of chametz in the mixture within a certain amount of time. For example, I'll just tell you this. B'medar amurim, b'sha'akal kizayis chametz, b'soch kedei achilas pras. So this is what I'll say, this is incredibly important, because we're going to see this in the Gemara. You could have a mixture of chametz, where there is so little chametz throughout the entire mixture, that when you consume the mixture, you actually don't end up consuming a kezayis of chametz within a significant amount of time. So what we're going to see, if the chametz is so diffused in the mixture that you wouldn't even end up consuming a kezayis b'chtei achilas pras, then ein achinami, under those circumstances, there wouldn't even be a lav. Again, just coming attractions, and we'll see that in the coming days. Zerabosai, shkoyach.